Hello and welcome to our first lecture in our fifth module in this online series in Cognition. In this introduction today, we're going to be talking about a brief introduction to different types of longer-term memories. First thing we want to do is sort of distinguish between longer-term memories and shorter-term forms of memory. Of course, we've already talked about shorter-term forms of memory. But I want to talk a little bit about the different kinds of long-term memory and different kinds of memory processes and that sort of thing. So we'll start with a basic sort of timeline of longer-term memories. So here we have somebody who sat down. 30 seconds ago is short-term or working memory. Everything else is long-term memory. So here we have earlier in the day, yesterday, last week, a year ago, 10 years ago. These are all different forms of long-term memory. Now we'll talk about how different types of long-term memory and long-term memory spans differ. So for example, I went shopping for clothes yesterday and I was walking to class. It's clearly context-based episodic memory. I remember my elementary school is actually part of autobiographical memory, and we'll talk later on about how autobiographical memory is both episodic, that is based on context, like where your elementary school was, but also based on semantic memory, which is our knowledge, because you know that's where you went to school, that's part of your knowledge about yourself. So that's a little bit of a mix of two different kinds of memory. So here's what we're going to talk about in this introduction. This looks like a lot of material, but each of these is fairly brief. We'll talk first about interactions between working memory and long-term memory to try to bridge between what we talked about in Module 4 and into Module 5. Then we will talk about episodic memory, then talk about semantic memory, talk about the relationship between episodic memory and semantic memory. Then we'll briefly talk about procedural memory, talk about the distinction between implicit and explicit memory, declarative and non-declarative memory, and then we'll finish out with prospective memory. So let's start with interactions between working memory and long-term memory. Information is coded into lurking memory is encoded into long-term memory and retrieved from long-term memory via working memory. So whenever we are bringing something to consciousness from our longer-term memories, picturing what you did yesterday, trying to imagine what the inside of your apartment looks like, trying to remember a text you read 5 minutes ago, all of that comes from your episodic and long-term memories and into working memory. Remember, there was the episodic buffer in working memory, so that's how information comes into working memory, and that allows us to work with that information in working memory. Elaboration occurs when we encode experiences, new experiences in working memory, by linking information from long-term memory. So we're going to talk, for example, about what's called the self-reference effect in a lecture coming up. In the self-reference effect, you process information based on whether or not it applies to you. So you think about your life experiences and tie whatever it is you're trying to remember to those life experiences. So that type of elaborative processing is where we're trying to connect what we're trying to learn, what we're encoding, to something we already know or our previous experiences. So one of the classic findings in this area, in the interaction between working memory or shorter-term forms of memory and longer-term memory, is what's called the serial position effect, or what we call the serial position curve. And the serial position curve is an occurrence that participants tend to remember items from the beginning of a list and the end of a list, but not in the middle. So memory is based on its serial position within a list. So first item, second item, third item is the serial position. So here we have, if we plot out memory for many participants and many lists, you will get a nice smooth curve that looks something like this, where people remember information from the beginning of the list and information from the end of the list, and the stuff in the middle isn't remembered very well. So we find this in a variety of different studies. Henry Roediger has found, he's done it actually a couple of times, where he sees you actually get this kind of serial position effect for our ability to remember who the presidents were. We can go to Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, somebody. And that's sort of beginning of the list. And then there are some distinctive items within that sort of list of presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And then the Zachary Taylors and the others are sort of lost into history. And then we get to more recent events, and you sort of go backwards, and we're particularly good at those presidents that were fairly recently alive. So Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Reagan, Ford, Carter, Ford, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy, back that direction. So we get this kind of serial position effect. Now, the presidents are due to a different form of a different reason for memory. But the serial position curve is due to operations in working memory. So we have the primacy effect. Let's go back here. You can see at the beginning of the list, and the recency effect, which is at the end of the list, which is the more recent items. It's the primacy effect because they're the first items. So now the primacy effect is the observation that memory is usually superior for items at the beginning of the list, thought to be caused by encoding into long-term memory. And Rundis and some other investigators have found that if you actually track how often people rehearse items, they rehearse those first items more. If you think about what it would be like to be a participant in one of these list learning experiments, you're getting this list of words in front of you, and it's dog, cat, horse, and so you're going dog, cat, horse, and it's cow, dog, cat, horse, cow, and so you're able to rehearse those items over and over again. And so these items at the beginning of the list get a great deal of rehearsal because you're able to say them over and over again. Well, once we get out here to past 9 items, as we know from our studies of working memory, you really can't rehearse anything beyond that. So we get diminishing returns on rehearsal, and then this middle stuff doesn't get rehearsed at all. And then we get to the end of the list, and that's when we get to the recency effect. And memory here is usually superior for items at the end of a list, and this is thought to be caused by these items being available in working memory. So what's happening with the recency effect is we're dumping what's available in working memory, and then trying to remember items from the list. And in fact, if you look at what are called recall protocols, so in one of these experiments, you write down what words you can remember, and the items individuals tend to write down first are those from the end of the list, and then they go to the beginning of the list and work their way forward. And you see that in quite a few of these lists. Now, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll include a distractor task at the end of a list in order to eliminate that recency effect. So for 30 seconds or something, they'll do math problems or count backwards, or they'll do some other task to try to eliminate that recency effect. In other experiments, and in fact in one of the demonstrations we'll do in class, they'll actually cut off the first and last items. So we're going to do an experiment on the encoding specificity principle, and in that experiment we just don't analyze the items from the beginning or the end of the list so that we don't have any serial position effects. So that is one of the ways in which working memory and long-term memory interact, and we'll talk in a couple of other areas about this as well. That then gets us into talking about different types of memory. A lot of cognitive psychologists make big distinctions between memory systems and memory processes. I find it useful to think about memory in a more holistic way. There are systems, there are processes, and think about the types of memories. And whether it's a system or a process, it doesn't matter. But episodic memories, formally, is the neurocognitive memory system that encodes, stores, and retrieves memories of our personal experiences. Primarily, I think of this as context-dependent memory, because episodic memories are tied to our life's episodes. And that's why it's called episodic memory. These are specific times and places. And so if you can remember an episode in your life, you remember where you were and what you were doing. Now, as you get older, you'll remember the things and the times and the places less, or you'll get them confused. And we'll get into that later. But this kind of context-dependent memory is a really important concept when we start talking about learning and when we start talking about the neuropsychology of memory, which we'll do at the end of this module. We often call these also hippocampal-dependent memories. And when we talk about the neuropsychology of memories, we'll talk about how these are encoded and retrieved via the hippocampus, and that's why they're called hippocampal-dependent memories. There is a lot of work about the hippocampus, and in fact, places are a particularly important part of what the hippocampus does, and we talked about this when we talked about place agnosia in an earlier lecture when we were talking about different types of agnosia. We oftentimes think of episodic memory as sort of mental time travel because it takes us back to specific times and specific places. So this is episodic memory. It's to be distinguished from semantic memory, which is another form of long-term memory. Semantic memory is the neurocognitive memory system that encodes, stores, and retrieves information concerning knowledge of the world. So simply put, this is all of our knowledge. It's essentially semantic memory. These are things like, what is a duck? What is the capital of Maine? What ingredients are included in a margarita? These are types of semantic memory. This is just our world knowledge, and our semantic memory gets larger and larger as we get older and older. So we gain more facts, more knowledge, more information. These memories are independent of learning context, and that's an important distinction from episodic memories. So, episodic memories are tied to times and places, but semantic memories are not. So, you should all know that the first president of the United States was George Washington. I'm guessing that none of you would be able to tell me when and where you were when you learned that particular fact. That's because that information has become independent of its learning context, but at some point, you were able to do that. Your parents sat down and read you a story, and you remembered that was yesterday, or you came home from school and said, "Oh, Mom, we learned today about the presidents of the United States, and the first president was George Washington." Well, that's because semantic memories actually start out as episodic memories. So semantic memories form over time. That is, they become independent of their encoding context. They lose their connection to those times and places. So the goal of education then is to create semantic memories via episodic memory. And that's going to become very important when we, in the next module, talk about applications of memory, in particular, how to study effectively and basically learning how to learn. And one of the things that's really important to understand is that you want to try to get the things that you're learning independent of their learning context. You want to know the information without having to remember when and where you were when you learned something. Now, that being said, early on in the formation of semantic memories, information is linked to its time and its place. So if you're in an exam and you know you remember studying something, but you can't get at the information, one of the things that you can do is try to think about the time and place you were when you were studying that particular part of the material. We sort of call it context reinstatement. And this is a really great memory technique when you're trying to remember something, if you can get back to that time and place. Again, in the next module, we're going to talk about eyewitness testimony. And what often happens with eyewitnesses is we try to get them to really get into that context in what's called the cognitive interview. And that cognitive interview is to get people into that time and place of when they witnessed something so that we can get as much information, as much accurate information as possible. We'll talk also later in this module about some of my research where we actually asked people to reinstate learning context, and we showed that they could remember more semantic facts if they did so. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So that gets us to procedural memory. Procedural memory is sort of, in my view, kind of an interesting bridge between semantic memory and what we call implicit memory. It is a form of implicit memory. So semantic memory is facts. Procedural memory is also knowledge, but it's knowledge for how to do things. So how to ride a bike, how to use a hammer, how to drive a car. These memories are generally accessed and controlled without control or conscious attention. So we're able to do these things automatically. So if you've driven a standard transmission car or stick shift, you can often do that without any conscious awareness, that is shifting gears. If you haven't done it in a while, like I haven't, it'll probably take you a little while. But eventually you can do all of those motor sequences without much conscious attention. When needed, procedural memories are automatically retrieved and utilized for the execution of the integrated procedures involved in both cognitive and motor skills, from tying shoes to flying an airplane to reading. So all of these kind of basic motor skills eating, walking, talking, are basic procedural memories, playing the piano, hitting a baseball, catching a baseball. Oftentimes these are things that we can do without any sort of conscious awareness or any conscious thinking whatsoever. And in fact, usually we're better at them when we don't actually have to require unconscious awareness. So these are memories for how to do things. Now, we will revisit procedural memories in a little bit more detail when we start talking about the neuropsychology of memory, because individuals with amnesia, like patient HM, are oftentimes able to learn new procedural memories without any memory of ever having done so. So they can do new things, but they'll have no memory for ever having done them before, which is a really bizarre phenomenon. And that gets us right to implicit and explicit memories. Explicit memories are memories with conscious awareness. Episodic memory, working memory, and semantic memory are examples of memories for which we have conscious awareness. Implicit memories are those memories which we are not consciously aware of. So these are things like procedural memory, perceptual representation. So we talked back in our lecture on consciousness about priming, and that perceptual representation and priming is part of this kind of implicit memory. And individuals with amnesia tend to have intact implicit memories. And we'll talk about this again towards the end of this module. So explicit memories are those with conscious awareness. Implicit memories are those for which we are not consciously aware. Now, one of the things we talk about often in this area is ways in which these kind of explicit and implicit memories show themselves in very specific ways in our daily lives. And one of them is this idea of recollection and familiarity, or what's sometimes called a remember-no response. So recollection is when we specifically recall the context and details of a memory. So we specifically remember it, or we recollect it. So, fairly simple example, walking down the street, you see somebody you know from your class, you say, oh, that's so-and-so from my class, they sit in the back. You remember the specific context and details of that memory. Familiarity is when we recognize something as a recent memory, but cannot fully recollect the details, and this would be a no response. So, something seems familiar, but we can't really recollect the details. So back to our walking down the street example, that person looks really familiar. I know that person from somewhere. That is this kind of familiarity response. So you have a partially sort of conscious recollection. And so we believe that recollection is a clearly conscious episodic response, where familiarity may be occurring because of that kind of automatic, unconscious perceptual representation system, some sort of implicit memory where you get a sense of knowing something, but not a conscious sense of knowing something. So that gets us at the declarative, non-declarative distinction. This is explicit and implicit memory renamed. Cognitive psychologists love nothing if not to call things by multiple names. So we have declarative memories or explicit memories. These include our semantic memory and our episodic memories, facts and events. Our autobiographical memory actually encompasses both facts and events. Non-declarative or implicit memories include things like skills and habits. This would be procedural memory, priming, which is perceptual representation, simple classical conditioning, and non-associative learning. So that would be something like operant conditioning. Finally, we get to the last topic in this first lecture in Module 5 is prospective memory. And prospective memory is a form of memory that involves remembering to perform a planned action or recall a planned intention at some future point in time. Essentially, it's memory to do things in the future. So it would be things like, remember to pick up the dry cleaning on your way home. Remember to tell Bob that he's supposed to call his wife when he gets in. Remember to take these cookies out of the oven in 20 minutes. Remember to take these pills twice a day. So there are two different types of prospective memory we often talk about: time-based prospective memory and event-based prospective memory. And time-based prospective memory are things like, come back in 10 minutes. Now most of us, of course, will look at our watch and keep looking at it until 10 minutes have passed. But this is a more difficult type of task for many people, particularly older adults. So oftentimes, we want to think about how to give instructions to older adults or anyone who's slightly cognitively impaired, because time-based prospective memory is often difficult. So taking this pill twice a day or every 12 hours or every 8 hours, whatever it might be, or 6 hours, is probably not the best instruction strategy. It's better to use event-based prospective memory. Event-based is, when this happens, do this. So when you get home, do this. Or when you get up in the morning, do this. So an event-based prescription, for example, would be take this with breakfast and dinner. Or take this first thing in the morning and right before bed. Or if it's every 4 hours or 6 hours, take with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Something like that, something that's based on events. Prospective memory has a number of important applications, sort of some of the examples we've talked about, but it's actually one of the most important indicators of the ability of patients to manage their own lives. In particular, anyone with some sort of complex medication regime, this is a particularly important predictor of that ability. Well, that gets us to the end of our first lecture and our beginning discussions of longer-term forms of memory. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about ways in which we can encode information in longer-term memory, specifically episodic memory and what's called levels of processing.